So, in terms of what we're trying to cover this morning, we're largely looking at the design of online courses. But as I see throughout this presentation, we can't really just see that in isolation. There's quite a lot to consider before we even get to the point of designing and creating our courses. So just to set a little bit of context here, actually, Andy, one of the things that just thinking about, I can't actually see the chat while I'm presenting. So maybe if you shout, if somebody has a question, would you be able to do that?
Of course, yeah, no problem at all.
Okay. All right. So this is what described as a spectrum of e-learning. It's more accurately, it's a spectrum of learning. And as you can see, I put this together in 2010. So this is 10 years old now, and 10 years we've been dealing with this. And things have changed a little bit, but not too much. At the far right-hand side, we've got sort of class-based instruction, but where there might be computer-based materials that just support that in some way. So that's the sort of very edge of using technology in learning, but really that's still a way of learning which requires us to get people together in the same space and time. Obviously, you've got to organize that space and time. People have got to travel. So one of the issues with that kind of learning, even though you've got the computer-based resources, is that people spend quite a lot of time getting there. They've got to have the specific time in their diary, and they've got to commit the time to it. In some ways that's good, and in some ways that's not so good. So we move along a little bit. What we're doing this morning might be considered sort of in this realm, insofar as we might be an on-site class, or we might be a virtual class like this.
Hi, Phil, I can't hear you.
Blended learning, or as is sometimes described now, hybrid learning, is where actually we're using web-based learning, which is designed to take you through all of the information you need. So that might be videos, that might be e-learning, and then we add in something else as well. So we might add in web conferencing, we might add in coaching, etc. So it's really this sort of hybrid learning. That bit in the middle is where there's a kind of a sweet spot of where we're making the best use of both online and offline working. And you know, I'm sure Andy will agree with this. When we work with clients where they sort of use that kind of hybrid approach, that's one which generally gets good results.
Yeah, definitely. I know that you've been obviously you've sent through the slides for the equality and diversity inclusion, and I think so. Obviously, you're delivering that face to face, and it's how this sits alongside that. Really, you know, is it a pure e-learning or is it a blended learning option? So, but there is a scale there that, as Phil's kind of identified, that it needs to be considered in terms of what you're actually delivering online.
Yeah. And I think what one of the approaches that has emerged in recent years has been that blended learning. One of the very powerful things is to use online learning combined with coaching, mentoring, buddying up, so that you actually get sort of one-to-one, in not instruction but one-to-one help with putting the learning into practice. And of course, if this is learning at work, then that is actually the important point, that the learning doesn't just stay as learning, but actually gets put into practice. And that's where the coaching, internal coaching, external coaching, can really help with that. And then just to mention on the far left-hand side is what we describe as pure e-learning. That is the sense that, you know, this is e-learning, you access it whenever you want, you work at your own pace, you're usually off-site, you may have some sort of online support, but generally it's a sort of, you know, pull it off the shelf and use it. when you want. And I think probably in terms of some of the courses that are currently on the platform, that's kind of where they're attempting to be, in that pure e-learning space. Now, if they are there, if there's going to be no sort of intervention, human intervention, people are just going to go on the courses and use the materials, then the materials have to be slightly different. They have to be very interactive, and they have to help people check that they've actually understood, because that's it. That's what they get. And where we see that misused is where people can say, well, we've done it because we've created a course. You know, the question doesn't arise, are people actually learning? Have they done it? We can just tick a box and say, yes, they've done the instruction. So, you know, in some ways that's a great thing to have, and in other ways it's got to be used with a certain amount of caution. So, everyone okay? Any questions at this point Andy could read out to me?
No questions. I think we lost you for a little bit there, from a sound perspective, but no, I think it was only for 15 seconds or so we got the gist of it.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to just introduce this model, and this model sort of explains what we need to do outside of simply designing and developing our courses, because this model, ADDIE, analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate, has all of the things that need to happen if you're creating a learning instruction outside of design and develop. Now, when we go on, as we progress, we will be looking particularly at design and develop, but nevertheless, those two things shouldn't be in isolation. And again, spoke to Andy briefly about this. I think, you know, where we see courses where they've simply been designed and developed, it's almost immediately obvious, because they're just sort of flat, they're detached from the actual situation. They don't really achieve the objective that may or may not have been stated. So those are, you know, in isolation, that doesn't work. It's got to have this framework. And I think the best analogy when you're looking at this is to think of this in terms of a company taking a product to market. So if a company was taking a product to market, it wouldn't simply have the bright idea of creating a thingamajig, then go out and design that thingamajig and develop it, and then send it out there. Well, they might do, but they wouldn't get many people to buy it, and people will be wondering why it was on the supermarket shelves. The point is, you need to know what it is that your learners in this instance actually need. What are you trying to provide to them? And that who, what, where, when, how is very important. So what are you trying to provide to them? What context does this need to sit in? And be very clear about the goals that you're aiming for in terms of creating this e-learning. So before we even get to any sort of design or develop stage, there's a lot of work in that, which is kind of your market research, as it were. Finding out what would work, what could work, what people already know, where the gaps are, what the specific goals are that you're trying to achieve with your learning. So I'm just going to skip over design and develop, but you know, that's obviously there's quite a bit of work in those two stages. Then when we look at implement, if you were taking a product to market, this is where you go into a marketing gear. You start to find out where the people who really need this product are, how you get it to them very effectively, how you make sure that you make it look attractive and that you've got some sort of USP. So in your context, in the growth company, this is the kind of internal marketing and selling stage. If it's a compliance course, obviously, you've got the advantage of people being able to, you know, the managers say, you've got to do this course. But as you know, that's not always so simple either. Do the managers actually say that? Do they actually get people to go on the course, and do they follow up by making sure that people have done the course? So there's the question there, and then the evaluation is all about continually improving the product, and in this case, continually improving the course. So before your course actually hits the mass market, make sure that there's lots of testing and lots of feedback, and also make sure that you're getting that feedback as you go along, because people quite often that you're presenting this course to will actually be experts in some aspects of that learning. So have they got something to contribute back? Have they spotted something that's not quite right? Is there something that just isn't working well for people? And in my view, every course should finish with an evaluation that says, what did you learn? How was it for you? Did you find it easy to access? How are you going to implement this learning in future? That's a really important stage to get into courses. So as you can see, there's a lot that go into thinking about a course that you're going to put on the learning platform, not just the designing of it and the developing of it. However, we are going to focus on design and development from this point onwards. Just check for questions.
Yeah, Phil, so Charles asked a fantastic question. What's the best way to carry out the analysis? Would this be in employee surveys or focus groups?
I would say whatever works for the subject, because it will be slightly different depending on the subject. I guess I've seen focus groups used. I've seen surveys used. I think the difference is you can do a survey and get lots of response, so you can kind of cover a lot of people with, say, an online survey about what do you want to see. In, if we were doing information security, what do you want to see? If you get a focus group, you get the stuff that people can't put onto a questionnaire. So you can ask, you can prompt, and you can ask questions. And I would say also in this stage is quite, dealing with the experts in your organization about what needs to be in that course, because they may have been doing this course face-to-face, so and may still be doing some face-to-face work. So they know the audience, so they're the ones to ask, but also make sure that you ask the audience directly, because sometimes those experts make assumptions. And I think, Andy, you probably...
Yeah, so I think the analyze section or process is the one that's most often overlooked, but is actually the most important.
Yeah.
It really is important. So, for example, if you're delivering this into the Growth Co internal staff, what might be useful is just to almost spend a day in the life and understand what their situation and what their context is, and not only think about it from actually while they're in their office, but around that as well. So that starts to impact, well, do we need to make sure it's accessible by mobile? Do they want to have a look at it on the way to work? The first question would be, should it actually even be a course? Does it need to be a course? Could it be a resource instead? So actually, what are you looking to, it's almost what are you looking to change as a result of this edict? So this has come down that you need to deliver make sure everyone is equality, diversity, if I can say it, and inclusive in their approach. What does that actually mean? So is it about awareness, or is it about how they behave, or is it what skills they have? And really trying to drill down into that and figuring out. It's starting from that point. What change do I want to see, and therefore, how do I build this thing, whatever this thing is, depending on what my audience are and where they're at. And that's often, as I say, it's often the place that, or the thing that people skip over, but actually it's the most important thing. People just usually go straight to design, and it's we've got these training materials, we've got this PowerPoint. Let's make an interactive version of this course online. Well, how are people going to access it? What are you trying to change? How are you going to check that they changed? How are you going to help them practice that stuff, whatever you're trying to change? So I found that just speaking to people individually one-on-one, and asking them some quite prompting conversations really helps. I think that the challenge you've got with surveys and focus groups is you can get a bit of group think in those as well. So you get told what you've kind of asked, if that makes sense. So there's some challenges around that, but just having great conversations and really having a strong understanding, as Phil says, about products, and that's a really good way of thinking about it. And also think about it from a marketing agency. So if you were at KFC or something like that, and you were trying to push the latest burger or whatever, how would you raise awareness of that? How would you change their behaviour so that when they went, they would want it, and then they would actually, when they go into the KFC, that's the product that they choose. It's thinking about it through a different lens, I think. Help.
And the key thing is that if you skip that stage, invariably you're setting off with a set of assumptions, and you're designing and developing and implementing on the basis of those assumptions, and you just found out you've wasted a lot of time. So you get to the end of that, and actually, it hasn't achieved what you wanted to achieve.
Yeah.
The point I would say, there's 2 points as well about focus groups. If you are going to do focus groups, make sure that they're not all people from one department. Because that's where you get the group thing. Make sure that you really shake it up, so you have the chief executive in there with the cleaner if you possibly can. If this is going to be across all staff, have a really varied focus group that gets really interesting views from all levels and all areas of the organisation, not just one. And then the other thing before we move on, just to say, is that when you are doing this analysis with the experts in your organization, what you're going to have to do is, in the next stages probably, is temper what the experts want you to do, because they probably want you to create war and peace online. And I seem to remember you saying this when we met in the growth company. They will want absolutely everything in that course, and they will say that it's absolutely essential. It's really important to get the experts on board with the fact that you need to engage people in this course, and therefore what are the absolute essentials that people need to know, and make sure that you cover those, not try to cover absolutely everything. Try and explain to people that actually there will be elective parts to this course where if people want to know more about that subject, if they're interested, they can go off and learn more about it. But we need to stick to the things that people absolutely need to know, particularly with compliance courses. Okay, so moving on, as I say, what we're going to look at in this presentation is really around design and develop, but it's really important that you understand that those other stages are essential, not just simply nice to have. So the 2 Ds are about designing and developing. So what you've got to consider is what you're doing within this course, and considering the way it will be used, is that you're replacing the sort of teaching aspect. So can you make that really alive online? And Robert Gagne's, I think that's how you pronounce it, I've never been entirely sure, but he came up with 9 events for instruction, which I've always found very useful just to refer to. So his suggestion is that there are 9 events that need to happen in order for instruction, for learning, to be effective. So they are useful whether you're doing class-based learning, whether you're doing e-learning, or whether you're doing hybrid learning. The only difference is obviously you need to consider about where and how those events will actually take place. So here they all are, and they're relatively simple, although some of them are in a sort of a little bit odd in terms of the language that they use. So again, thinking of a kind of marketing approach to things, you've got to gain people's attention. And again, whether you're in a class or whether you're online, it doesn't matter. The last thing you want is hostages, because hostages look out the window, hostages click through the e-learning course to get to the quiz at the end. you're not achieving your objectives. So you've got to make this interesting, and you start with something which is really going to get them engaged in the course. And after this slide, I'll show you some wireframe examples of an e-learning course and how that looks in practice. Then the second point is people need to know what it is that
Hi, Phil. Your sound's dropped again.
stimulating recall of prior learning is an interesting one, and it's something that we really don't do enough. A lot of people who are doing your course will already know something about the subject. So if you can stimulate recall of that, then that's great. If you can say, what do you know about this subject already, and acknowledge that, and I'll ask Andy to come in on this, because there's another aspect to this which is sort of a little bit more recent, is that it's not just recall of prior learning. If we can make our online courses what's described as adaptive, then we can stop people having to go through the boring bits that they already know. So adaptive learning, in this sense, would not only stimulate recall of prior learning, it would sort of ask people important questions. And if they demonstrate enough knowledge of that subject, we can say, okay, you go straight to section 2. And that overcomes a lot of the complaints about learning where people just have to go through things that they know perfectly well, because someone thinks that just going through it is sufficient to make them learn it. Well, it's not, because they won't take any notice of it. They'll think, I know this already, so they'll just click through it.
Mm. And that's kind of references your hostages.
Yeah.
Situation where, the last thing you want to do is you don't want people to feel like they have to be forced through this thing. Obviously, you've got the compliance needs, but actually you want them to behave differently, or you want to have a different skill, or have some knowledge that they can call upon. And if you don't want to do that at the behest, you don't want to force them through stuff at the behest of actually the stuff they need to learn.
Yeah. And if you, the great thing with technology is that you can actually create things where if people do already know that, and they can show that they know that particular part of the subject, then actually the instruction, the learning takes them to the part that they need to be at. But in a much simpler way, you can just say, if you've passed this quiz, this little assessment, then you can go straight to section 4. So you give it as a manual instruction. Obviously, it's preferable if it's kind of automated and almost seamless, but it is possible to do it without a lot of technology and a lot of very sophisticated sort of e-learning techniques.
And I think just to add to that, the afternoon of the day's session, which we had planned, was around actually how to take what you may design and build it into something called H5P. And H5P out of the box, I'm correct in my thinking there, Phil, doesn't it? It does have a sense of adaptive stuff, so you can do some certain checks, and then what it would do is it skips certain slides so that people can go to the bit that's more relevant to them and not have to revisit information that they already know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you can create adaptive learning. And the other thing in Moodle as well is that Moodle has a module which is called Lesson, and that's designed to be that. So you can have a section with a quiz and assessment in it, and depending on the score from that assessment, it will take them to section 3, section 5, section 8, whatever. So you can create adaptive learning with the native tools in Moodle as well. So moving on to 4 is actually presenting the stimulus, more simply displaying the content, actually, the learning that you want people to get. And there are some, within this, there are some very simple rules, because you can you can use text, and you can also use voiceover. Now, there are pluses and minuses about each, but ideally, you might look at using a combination of the two. And the other thing you would put in there is video. So a combination of ways of presenting the stimulus, it just provides variety. Pages and pages and pages of text are just wearying for most people, particularly on the screen. The other major pitfall, which I've seen so often in e-learning, is not to have e-learning where there is text on screen and the voiceover simply reads out the text. If somebody needs that for accessibility issues, that's a different thing. But actually, for most people, it actually has a really negative effect on learning if you've got text on screen that is also being read out, and it's the same for when you do a presentation. So that's definitely something to avoid. And then in terms of providing learner guidance, this is really just setting that content into context, making it relevant to the growth company. So this is not simply some sort of esoteric piece of e-learning. You know, if it's health and safety, what are the particular issues around health and safety at the growth company? You know, very few people in the growth company are operating heavy machinery. So, you know, you don't need to have that. You need to have health and safety related to the activities of the growth company. And then number 6 is where you're sort of saying, okay, you've had that, we've presented the stimulus, we've given you the content. What actually do you know? Now, for something else that I'm doing, I've actually been doing some online learning where it's just a continual stream of learning and there is no eliciting performance in it. And I can tell you that it's just, you know, you find yourself actually kind of sleepwalking through the materials, because it's at this point where you pull your learners up and they say, okay, what have you learnt? And if you haven't learnt it, so in other words, if you don't get the right marks on that assessment, can you take them back to the beginning to go through it again? Can they pull out the bits that they'd missed? And the more times they do that, the more they're going to learn. It may, to some extent, be a frustrating experience for some people, but then what they need to do is demonstrate that they have actually learnt that piece of content, that they're not simply clicking through this. So that's a really important part of the kind of interaction. And then the providing feedback goes absolutely with that. You know, you pass the assessment, it did take you 4 goes to do it. So it's actually providing the feedback that they need in order to understand whether they're doing well or maybe not doing so well, but trying to encourage them at the same time to go through the materials. And then the assessing performance is more towards a kind of summative exercise, providing feedback so that they can, it reinforces their view of their own performance. And that might be, assessing performance would be very much the kind of end test idea that you have in quite a lot of the newer courses which are on the learning platform. In other words, there are little assessments which are not, you know, they don't count towards any sort of mark or final assessment, but there is an assessment at the end which is designed to really test their knowledge, and they have to pass that assessment in order to be considered safe to operate or compliant or whatever, or just knowledgeable about that subject. You know, as I say, with the thing that I'm doing at the moment, you know, there is none of that, and therefore you sort of drift through the materials, and then at the end, all you've possibly got is a sense of self-satisfaction. You have no measure of, do I actually know that? Have I learned anything? I don't know, do you want to say anything on that, Andy? Is that a...
No, that's a great summary of the kind of, so you may not, I think generally sticking to this order really helps, yeah. But it is flexible as well, and then there's certain bits that you'll want to focus on and certain bits that you'll focus less on, depending on the course and as it flows. But I think the best e-learning courses I've been on have used all of these elements in that general form. And I think using a framework like this can really help structure what you do.
Yeah, and agree with that, and add to it that remember that this is not necessarily all online. So providing feedback might be the line manager providing feedback and assessing their performance. Saying, well, you did pass, but you only got the pass mark. What is it that you still don't quite understand? Where did you go wrong? Maybe showing them the questions that they didn't answer right. And when it comes to the last point, 9, enhancing retention and transfer, this is where there's a lot of focus now on how do we actually make sure that this works in the workplace? How do we make sure that 10 minutes after doing the course, people haven't forgotten everything that they've learned about? And how do we make sure that they actually put it into practice if it's the sort of thing that you can put into practice? So this again is where that kind of hybrid learning really comes into its own. So where you can harness your materials on the learning platform with coaching, with mentoring, with the line manager, also maybe have small group work afterwards. That's another option, to sort of help sort of get that sort of learning into practice. There's lots of ways of doing it, and some of that will be online, some of it will be offline. So it's a question of just using the right mode, really, that gives you the best results.
And I guess there's a quite common. There's a lot you can lean on in terms of the marketing playbook. So there's a lot of campaign-based learning at the moment. So not only you may have deliver this course on e-learning, for example, through the Moodle platform, but how can you raise awareness around the office? How can you create a month around it, build some interest in it, create a scoreboard or a leaderboard, or help people monitor each other afterwards? If you look at what's happening at the moment with coronavirus and washing hands, that's changing behaviour. That's changing how people act in the workplace, and they're using prompts all over the place. Is that kind of everyone's bought into it? There's that kind of societal thing as well. So think about it. I often I found it useful is think about it from a marketing perspective. If you're trying to market this thing, how would you potentially do it? And that it tends to generate a lot of ideas.
Yeah, I'm washing my hands so often now that I'm having to use hand cream because I get so stressed.
Yeah. Chill's got a comment. So we've recently started contacting learners around 1 month after attending a workshop to ask them questions about what they've changed as a result of attending the course, and what, if any, barriers have stopped them from putting into practice to increase our understanding and try and measure success of learning. That sounds great. I think anything with all this stuff, it's much about awareness as well as actually what they're learning and keeping it kind of top of mind. So something we've done with other clients is created like automated marketing emails after, it might be up to 12 months after this learning intervention, whether that's face-to-face or online, has happened, and try and use that not only as a way of kind of gauging how they're progressing with it, but just keeping it on the radar. There's so much stuff fighting for people's attention. Whether that be the day-to-day job or the top edict from the MD, or what you guys want them to do in HR, and it's difficult. It's trying to cut through that noise somehow and make sure that the messages you want to get across are on their radar.
Yeah, and there's a popular focus at the moment is something called micro learning. And you could follow up a substantial course, for example, with little bits of micro learning. So just sending things out to people through a forum or on email or on text message or WhatsApp or whatever, which actually just refer back to your course, maybe give them a little bit of up-to-date knowledge, ask them a few questions, and ask them those questions about how they're sort of putting things into action. So follow the kind of marketing example and keep stirring the pot, as I always describe it, to make sure that people putting it into practice. So what we'll do now is just look at some of these, some of the 9 events. We'll go through them all and how they might look like in practice in terms of designing an online course. And just to say, the course that we'll look at is simply a wireframe for a course. It's not a finished course. So don't think that this is a design disaster. It's just that it's not a finished course. It's just the sort of planning that we would do using slides, slideshow of some sort, just to plan out how the learning would work before we actually start putting it into a kind of e-learning format. So it's kind of rough and ready, but it demonstrates how this would work. So this is actually about this is a course which is about going to trade shows. And what it's designed to do for the company is to make sure that when people go to trade shows, they actually do something worthwhile and they get something out of it. They get the most that they can out of it. So those will generally be the objectives. And you present these to the learner. What you're saying here is you're going to, if you do this module, you're going to learn how to get ready for a trade show and why you should plan for the trade show and how you should choose the trade shows that you're going to go to. So those objectives are relatively simple, and that's not a bad thing. You know, a course to have 2, 3, 4 objectives and cover those objectives well. So again, in the context of some of the courses that you've got now, you might want to think about chopping those up into slightly smaller modules so that they're a little bit more accessible. So this is where we stimulate the recall of prior learning. So what we're saying to the learner here is, what happened last time you went, you know, what was your experience when you last visited? And depending on their feedback here, you might give some sort of feedback to them, which sort of just encourages them to go on and complete certain point out particular parts of the course that will be useful for them. Or if this was a slightly more sort of technical question, you might actually shift them to the relevant sections then, depending on their answer. And then this is where you present the stimulus material, in other words, your content. Okay, so this is obviously a sort of really important point from thinking about going to a trade show. You just say there are 4 stages. Make it simple, divide it up, and then you can have these 4 stages. So what will happen when the learner clicks on the first picture is that will come up and explain what is involved in that first stage, and may present the actual content within that. So you're providing a nice, easy page that they can go back to if they have to go and, you know, if they have to go and walk the dog after stage 2, because hopefully they're doing this at home, then they can come back and easily pick up and know that they've got to carry on from stage 3. So staging things is really important, just like chapters in books. And then this is where we're putting in the learner guidance. So we're putting in some sort of context here. What you're doing here is presenting 2 different experiences so that they can relate to those. And that, from this point on, they might think, well, I'm more like Nicole or I'm more like Darren. But they understand, you know, it just sets in context what actually can happen to you when you go to a trade show, and maybe how your approach to that trade show dictates what you get from it.
I think just to, if I could just add to that, Phil, on the previous one, is I think this could be a very powerful tool when it comes to the EDI. If you go to number 5, Phil, the case studies. Oh.
Hey, sorry.
Okay. Because, you know, from my understanding of kind of unconscious bias and equality, diversity, inclusivity, it's all very much about, it's about awareness, and it's very difficult to, I guess, be in somebody else's shoes on this stuff. I think there's ways that you can start to probe and create that light bulb moments for people. and they think, ah, now I get it. Now I understand why this is relevant. It's not just something that's come down from, from the top to say we must do it for legislative reason. It actually has a big difference to people's days and lives, and this is the kind of stuff that you can really start to play quite a lot on with EDI stuff. So, you can do stuff where, and this is part of the stuff that we'll show you with what you can do within Moodle and the materials is, this is a situation you might find themselves in. And I've seen some of the situations in the EDI presentation that you sent through, Cheryl. But it's almost rather than spoon feeding, it's like, why would that be uncomfortable for somebody? Can you suggest why? And I think it's trying to elicit it out of someone's head rather than telling them. And I think this whole scenario-based opportunity could be really powerful for the EDI course.
And the more real you can make it as well, so if you've actually got case studies that you can use, and either people are happy for you to use them or you anonymize them, but you make sure that you say to people, this really happened in the growth company.
Yeah.
Because otherwise they can feel that they're reading something which is kind of esoteric or general or whatever. If you can locate it in the growth company, it makes it much more vibrant and real, and makes people actually think about it. Yep.
Brilliant.
So then what we've got here is a little exercise that just elicits performance. Now, this is not a test in the sense that it's not judged. It doesn't go to any marks or anything. All you're saying is which stands should Keisha visit when she attends. And the background and preparation tabs there would give explanation about Keisha, what she does, etc., and then the preparation that she's done should do, and then you choose which stands she should visit, and maybe the order of those stands that she should visit. And there'll be a key to the stands. It's not just a numerical choice, but it'll explain. So you're actually putting into practice on this slide all of the things that you should have learnt in the previous slides. And if you don't get if you fail comprehensively, then the materials should take you back or suggest that you go back and learn again. And this is the feedback, as we say. This is not quite, but you got the majority right, but there was one that you got wrong, and you might include in that feedback, go back and do section 5 again, or 4, look at that again. And then this is where we assess performance. So this is more of a serious attempt to find out.
Phil, you've dropped out. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm sure he'll come back in a second.
Etc. All of those things could be used, and as I say, because it's a serious test, it doesn't need to be dull and dry multiple choice questions. As far as possible, keep engaging people even at this stage. And then this is a little bit of information that they provided. It's a template, basically. So if you were planning to go to a trade show, that what they're suggesting here is that in future you use this template. So it's just embedded in this page, and you can click on the print button, and that will give you the template to use for visiting trade shows in future. So what you're doing is you're helping them put all of this into place, because the headings on that template will help them to remember what they learned in the course and actually put it into action. And as you can see in that top right hand corner, there's a little resources thing there that might have more resources behind it that they can actually use as well. But again, for this purpose, they're just keeping it simple and saying, great, you've got through the course, you've learnt it all, here's something to help you actually put the learning into practice. So just going back to kind of where we were at the beginning, it's the question is, where will the learning happen? And these are the kind of the options really: face to face in the classroom, one to one. Distance, very popular at the moment because everybody seems to be at distance. Where will people be doing this? Will they be doing it at work, but distant, if you like, from the trainer, or right across, across a national network or whatever, and then consider ways of learning through things like mobile, tablet, and laptop. And again, as we said right at the beginning, a mixture of all of those sort of things is that kind of sweet spot, the hybrid blended learning, where you've got the human element in some form or other, could be on a web conference, not necessarily face to face, and you're using the best channel for that particular piece of learning and to get that learning into practice. So those 9 events are not necessarily all in the same place or all at the same time. It might be a process that you're using to cover the whole of those 9 events. So what I've just said before is about the 9 events taking place over different channels. Keeping it active for each learner is something that I'm really keen on, and it's what I described before as stirring the pot. If you can't be bothered, why would your learners not be bothered? So you've got to find ways of just keeping it active, and this is particularly important where you might be using forums in courses. So many times I hear people say, well, we put a forum in the course, but nobody used it. Well, why would they? What you actually do is make that forum, for instance, a part of the course, and you ask a question which stimulates discussion. So if that's what you want, you've got to take an active part in making those things happen. And then, as you've heard me say before, doing this sort of stuff in harness with coaching and mentoring is a fabulous way to get it in place in the workplace. And in your courses, or excuse me, outside of the course, if you can create learner interaction, if you can get them to go and explore more about that subject, then you're really doing the job of stimulating learning in the company. And some of that could be enhanced by excuse me, personal and group reflection. For some applications, an online journal that fits with the course is a very, very useful thing, as long as somebody is going to look at that journal. So it can be a learning log, a journal, describe it whichever way you want. People will pretty soon stop putting anything into that if nobody's looking at it, although it is partly for their own use. But is there someone that they can share that journal with? Not everyone, obviously, but you would have someone like their line manager or someone who would then go in and make comments about that journal. So you're stimulating them to reflect on what they've learned, put it into their own words, apply it to their own situation, think about it, and then get feedback from their manager or someone that they're buddied up with for this purpose. If they don't get that, it's not going to happen. So again, it's about being active with the learning.
I think this, just on that, I think there's lots of different tools that you can pull on, and it's just a case of really thinking quite creatively and thinking about your audience. Depending on the topic, a lot of people use gamification techniques. That's quite a hot topic at the moment. So that sense of competitiveness, or leaderboards and scoreboards and getting points and badges. There's, it depends on the topic, but that can work quite well, particularly if it's stuff around sales training, that kind of thing. And then just to that group reflection. I guess the challenge sometimes with e-learning is it's always open. One of the great things about e-learning is it's always available, and the downside is it's always available. So there isn't the same kind of urgency. So, if you really wanted people to complete it, jump into their team meeting and say, right, we're going to have 5 minutes to chat about this equality, diversity, and inclusion piece. Just really keen to hear people's thoughts, and the amount of people that might do that then before the actual meeting. Just creating that sense of urgency and deadlines can be quite powerful, and there's just different ways that you can do that.
Yeah, Yeah, and it particularly, like you say, the fact that it's you can do it at your own pace at any time is both helpful and a hindrance. So if you can link that to some sort of human element of someone sort of encouraging them to carry on with the course or complete the course, then that's much more powerful. Because otherwise, if there's no pressure on them to complete it, it will always take a back seat to other things which are more urgent, but maybe not as important.
Just a good example I've just had, just to quickly. So one of my friends, he does the training and development for Gymshark, which you may have heard of. They're quite a big burgeoning business. And what he's actually done is he's set, it's for GDPR for the organisation. He said everyone in the organisation has to complete the first module before anyone's allowed onto module 2. And it works within their culture because they name and shame. And it's worked incredibly well. So that they've done something called I can't remember, but they've created a lot of video content based off the in-betweeners.
Yeah.
I can't remember what how they've changed it, but it's again depending on, you've got lots of different tools, and sometimes it's just thinking a little bit more creatively about how you do it and how you can get that group. I won't suggest naming and shaming is perhaps the best way to do it, but it certainly works for their culture because it's all about ownership and driving forward and where we're going to be, and we have to move fast. So there's different ways you can do that.
Herd mentality, and it works.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So these are potential stages in terms of the design and development, not the rest of it. So you can create a skeleton course, and this was one of the things we suggested a long way back in terms of Moodle. You can actually use it. You can keep a course offline, and you can just start to build up your materials within that skeleton. So you can just find out where all your materials are and just stick them in a Moodle course so you can access them easily. So if they're PDFs or something, you just upload the PDFs, upload the Word documents, you know where everything is, but that's not the form that your course is going to take in the end. So then developing the skeleton more widely using that ADDIE, so thinking about, yes, you've got some existing materials, but actually let's strip it right back to the beginning and say, analyze the needs, go through all of that kind of that process, that research process first. One of the things that we do encourage people to do if they can is to develop staff coaching and mentoring skills, so that actually it's not just the stuff on the platform. You're actually got a mechanism for putting things in place, and if staff have got coaching and mentoring skills, then they're keen to use them. They're keen to help other people learn. It can be really valuable. We talked about the feedback. What else do learners want? Sometimes we make the assumption that the HR department or the learning and development department knows what they deal with the compliance courses and then what people need to know. But actually, maybe there's something out there that you haven't thought of yet that people need. So, not just in terms of a course, but in terms of the wider learning needs, what is it that people need or want or would like to see? You may not have thought of that yet. And when I say be adventurous here, there is a tendency to stick to what you know. And if you stick to what you know, it's probably going to get a bit boring. So you've got to be a little bit brave here and just push the boundaries a bit. Use things that you may not be so comfortable with, but always test your courses first. Because if you're putting something in there like interactive video and it doesn't work on somebody else's machine, you need to know that before it goes out to the market. And of course, part of that would be thinking about, is there an opportunity to use 3D, H5P, for instance? You could create, and this is just an example, you could create a 360 view of the office, and you could put particular points on that 360 view that people need to be aware of in terms of health and safety. So people could then scan around the office and see what I was talking about before, the reality of that at the growth company rather than some esoteric thing, and actually sort of interact with the materials.
Um, I realise we're kind of running out of time, but just on the
All right.
on that kind of on the with a really good approach that some organisations take is to create like ambassadors for learning internally. So they would involve them throughout. It's almost like a pilot group. So
Yeah.
they would actually involve them in the process of creating the materials, and then when those materials have been created, they are kind of one from each section. So they would
Yeah.
kind of encourage people within their department to complete the training and to talk to them about it. And because they've got skin in the game in terms of they've helped to develop the materials, that really helps create a buy-in across the whole organisation. And that's something that John Lewis are quite strong on.
Okay.
They do a lot around that. So they'll do that from a shop floor perspective. So they'll have people walking around with iPads, helping other staff on the floor,
Right.
answer questions for clients. So it really is worth thinking about if you can create like almost like a working or a pilot group internally for this kind of stuff. People that are really into it that can help. You can help use their energy and their passion for or just their desire to do better. Try and piggyback off that to cascade it across the organisation.
Yeah. Okay.
There we go.
There we are.
Yeah.
Done.
So, Cheryl and Ben,
Yes.
does that help? I'll give you a bit of an introduction into, I guess, ourselves and Phil's approach to instructional design.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. I think obviously talking about the theory and the example frameworks to use, it gives us a lot to think about, especially not having this background before. So particularly looking at content already and not even necessarily thinking about the analysis right at the beginning, which you said is one of the most important stages. So that's really useful to bear that in mind. And obviously trying to be more creative and looking at the different options out there available, as well as ensuring that we follow up afterwards, because it's something that we've started to look at, but it's also looking at what else we can do to try and continue that momentum and get people engaged. And obviously the opportunity to reflect on it afterwards is going to be an important feature of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
You mentioned about the H5P. So is that something that is available to everybody, or is it something that has to be purchased separately? I've not heard of that before.
Yeah, so that's correct me if I'm wrong, Phil. So you've got a system called Moodle, which is a learning management system. What H5P allows you to do is create interactive content that sits within Moodle.
Right.
So it's, I guess, had we done this face to face, the plan was really to kind of give you an introduction into instructional design in the morning, help you or work with you to kind of tease out what if you applied those instructional design processes to the EDI course, what that might be, and just get you going on that. And then have a look at H5P, so how you actually take what you create and create an online piece of content that can sit within Moodle using H5P.
And to be clear, you've already got H5P in Moodle.
Oh, okay.
If you're creating courses and material in Moodle, you just use H5P as one of the activities that you insert into a course.
Yeah.
Right.
So what we were going to suggest from here really is, obviously there's lots of food for thought there, but we do think it's almost worth having a look at the EDI course as a whole, and just taking a step back and kind of letting yourself and Ben have a reflect on how you could maybe approach that differently. So both from a kind of a course perspective, so how you may approach the course, how you may get buy-in to the course and create awareness around it, but then perhaps pick a couple of examples or very small examples within it and use those specific instructional design techniques to tease one or two kind of areas out. So for example, you've got, I think slide 8 is the three main types of discrimination. So you've got direct discrimination, indirect, and victimization. So obviously it's a bit of a topic you've got to be careful with, but I think that's almost part of the design process. So how could you do that in a way that isn't, bullets on a screen? How could you try and tease that out, perhaps using that scenario stuff? And I think could be quite powerful. So it's almost a case of what we would suggest is we kind of leave that with you guys to have a think about. We can then kind of reconvene and see where you've got to with it. And then the next stage will be then, okay, once you've got to a place where you're happy with that content, then how do you actually build this thing? And that's when we would help you with that as well. But that's how we're thinking about it, because obviously it's a lot to absorb.
Yeah.
rather than now, a lot to think about. And perhaps it's provided more questions than answers, or more provocative thoughts, really, because it is a bit of a mind shift. You know, if we just put out your stuff online, you'll always get the kind of buy-in and the output that you've always got.
Yeah.
So it's just more, you know, it might be a case of opening Pandora's box a little bit, but if you can try use some of the prompts that Phil's gone through, it might just change how you approach this kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah, and especially because with this particular instance, we know from feedback that people aren't engaging with it. They find it very boring and obviously too heavy on the legislation, as I mentioned anyway, and it's just not interactive. There's nothing there to elicit the information anyway. I think we might have a few questions at the end, but it's very limited in terms of interaction and quite content heavy, which can probably seem quite boring and difficult to engage people because of all the reasons that we've gone through. We've not gone and had a look at what we should be doing to try and engage people and to make it more interesting, more interactive. So it'll be good to take a step back and reflect on that, really.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I think, I mean, and as Phil said, I mean, those principles apply to face-to-face training as much as they do online training. It's just good instruction, really. So how about we send you the slides? What we do here a lot at Campbell is we use something called the persona canvas, which is where you almost create like so you've got that person in your head who you're trying to change in some way, shape or form, but you're understanding their context, their situation, what their needs are, what their frustrations are, and that's something that can often be quite a good way of just having a physical on paper, a manifestation of who you're actually building this thing for. And that helps quite a lot. So I'll send you an idea of what that might be. And then if we leave you to have a think about that, about the how you could apply what Phil's talked about to EDI, then we could pick that up as the next stage and you know, figure out, I guess, just touch base and see how your ideas have developed, and from there figure out the next stages forward.
Yeah, sounds good.
I'll make this recording available as well, so that you can relive the entire experience.
I'm glad I didn't swear all the way through it then.
Yeah, very well behaved.
Well, I guess anything from your side, Phil? Anything else?
No, I think that's fine. Covered. Yeah.
Brilliant. Ben, all good with you?
Yeah, man, definitely, yeah.
Brilliant. Well, you can, you know, I'm glad you've not put your video camera on, because you obviously sat there with no clothes on. But
Jams at best.
You've got your Leeds United scarf on, I can imagine.
I wish.
I was going to say goes without saying.
I bet you've got Leeds United gym jams.
Hey, it was obviously off for a reason, isn't it? So
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we'll follow up with those files, and then let's. I guess just if you want to get in touch with us when you've kind of obviously the situation is very fluid at the moment. If you want to get in touch with us when it's useful to touch base, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, great.
Brilliant.
Thank you both.
Thank you very much for your time.
Right. See you soon.
Thank you. All the best. Be safe.
Bye. You too. Bye.